Hello and welcome to another Modern Horizons 3 set review video. I'm Paul Cheon, and today we're going to be going over the black cards. Now, if you wanted a quick rundown on my grading scale and the mechanics of the set, I do have a link to all of my card rankings for the black cards in the description below, so make sure you check that, and you can also use that to kind of follow along with the video. Once I'm done with the entirety of my set reviews, I will have a master sheet that has all the colors and all my reviews for all the cards that you can reference when you hop into your next Magic Online or Magic Arena draft. Now, before this I was going to say draft, but before this video fires, I did want to say, if you've enjoyed the content and wanted to support the channel in another way, I do have a Patreon channel. The link to the Patreon is in the description below. I did launch a new tier of the Patreon, so make sure you check that out and see all the different offerings depending on the tiers. All right, let's head straight in here to the first card in Accursed Marauder. 1 in a black for a 2/1 zombie warrior. When a Cursed Marauder enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a non-token creature. That's a really nice piece of text there, meaning your opponents can't sacrifice a random Eldrazi spawn token to kind of go around what this card is trying to do. So, what does this mean? Well, it's basically a 2-mana sorcery speed edict. It's a 2-mana 2/1, and when it enters a battlefield, your opponent has to sacrifice a non-token creature, and you do as well. But because you're casting the Accursed Marauder, you can sacrifice the Accursed Marauder. Now, one clever thing your opponents can do is, with Accursed Marauder trigger on the stack, they can actually use a removal that kills small creatures to kill the Accursed Marauder if your other creature in play is something big. So be on the lookout for something like that. Now, I think this card isn't the strongest, but because black is looking to do sacrifice things, I imagine that there's also going to be cards that, for example, have persist, or small things that you want to actively sacrifice. So I think for that reason, I'm going to give Accursed Marauder a low C because I think there's going to be enough support for effects like this. For example, there's a red exploit card that lets you threaten something, right? So let's say for 6 mana, you play that 4 mana 3/3, exploit, threaten a card, attack, and then you can play Accursed Marauder to sacrifice the creature that you stole. All right, moving on, we have Arcbound Condor, 2 black for an artifact creature bird. It's a 0/0, however, it's got flying and modular 3, meaning that this creature enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters on it, and when it dies, you may put its +1/+1 counters on target artifact creature. Whenever another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. This card is really, really sweet. I mean, it's a 4 mana 3/3 flyer, which is already pretty solid, but if you're black-red or you just have other artifact creatures lying around, when this dies, you get to move the 3 counters onto something else. That already is a good card. In addition to that, whenever you play another artifact, you can give a creature -1/-1 until end of turn. So if you can, let's say, play 2 artifacts, you can give something -2/-2. So Arcbound Condor is a very, very well-statted creature that's going to be solid in basically, any artifact-based deck. If you're black-red, this card is absolutely amazing. Arcbound Condor gets a B for me. Now, if you're 0 artifacts at all, and this is the only artifact in your deck, then no, this card's not very good. It's probably a low C level card because it's just a hard to cast 4 mana 3/3 flyer. But if you have any other artifacts at all, or have a deck built around artifacts, this card is excellent. Moving on, we have Breathe Your Last. This is 1 black instant. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. That's Hero's Downfall at common? You gain 1 life for each of its colors. It's a strictly better Hero's Downfall at common. Now, killing planeswalkers is not going to happen that often, but there is a cycle of creatures that turn into planeswalkers in this set. So you can use this to kill those planeswalkers. Not only that, you get to gain life, right? Oftentimes you're going to kill a single colored card. So this is a Hero's Downfall that gains you a life. And then whenever you kill a gold card, it gains you 2 life. Now remember, when you kill one of those Devoid Eldrazi's that have colors in their casting cost, those cards are considered colorless, so you don't gain a life. But again, this is just a murder with upside. It gains you the life, And that's not something you can completely ignore. So Breathe Your Last gets... You know what? I'm going to go with low B here. It's just unconditional removal, very, very good, particularly in a set that's looking to kill very large things, because the red-green deck's looking to ramp into Eldrazi, and additionally, the fact that you can gain life as well, I think this is an excellent, excellent removal spell. Moving on, we have Buried Alive, 2 and a black sorcery. Search your library for up to 3 creature cards, put them in your graveyard, then shuffle. This is an 8-card disadvantage. Sure, you can have maybe some ways to recur things. If you have a Reanimate spell, then maybe this card can go up in value, but you're still down a card. Buried Alive is not something I'm too interested in playing in any of my decks. I'm going to give that a D. Moving on, we have Chthonian Nightmare, 1 and a black for an enchantment. When Chthonian Nightmare enters a battlefield, you get 3 energy, okay? Pay X energy. Sacrifice a creature, return Chthonian Nightmare to its owner's hand, return target creature card with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. So, this is kind of a play on the card Recurring Nightmare, but only for kind of small things, unless you found out a way to generate energy in other ways, right? So, this card by itself is a 2-mana enchantment, gives you 3 energy, so you can sack a thing to return a 1, 2, or a 3 drop from your graveyard onto the battlefield. That's pretty interesting, right? It is a sack outlet, right? You can sack any creature, and so if you need a sack outlet, this card can be pretty useful. Now remember, again, I go back to kind of that threaten effect. That threaten effect, let's say you have the Chthonian Nightmare in play, then you play the threaten exploit creature, then you play this, you sack that creature that you steal, and you just get back a 1, 2, or 3 drop, and that's pretty solid. So it's a solid card. Now, you're not doing anything too busted with this, but it does give you 3 energy, so I think this card is pretty reasonable. You do have to go through some hoops to make this playable, but I think in any black strategy, this card can be decent. I'm going to give Chthonian Nightmare a C. Moving on, we have Consuming Corruption, black instant. Consuming Corruption deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life, where X is the number of swamps you control. So, if you can play this for 2 mana on turn 2, you get to deal 2 damage to something, and you gain 2 life. But this card scales. But how well will this card scales? Well, obviously, if you're mono black, which I don't anticipate most decks being mono black, but if you do go mono black, this is a payoff card, and then it can be like a 2-mana murder. It can be like 2 mana, deal 4, gain 4. Or 2 mana, deal 5, gain 5. And that's awesome, right? That's very, very strong. But I think in most decks, this is going to be 2 mana. It's kind of hard to cast. Deal 2, maybe 3 damage, and you gain that amount of life. Now, again, dealing 3 damage requires you to have 3 swamps in play, which isn't always the easiest thing in the world, right? You're going to need like 11 swamps to have 3 swamps in play on turn 3 some of the time to pull this off. So I'm going to give Consuming Corruption a C. If you're mono black, then it's a B level removal spell. Crabomination, 4 black for a 5/5 crab demon. Emerge from artifact, 5 black. So it costs more for the emerge cost. You may cast this spell by sacrificing an artifact and paying the emerge cost reduced by that artifact's mana value. So this is emerge, but only from artifacts only. So you can only sack artifacts to play this for cheap. But when you do, you get really nice value. When Crabomination enters a battlefield, target opponent exiles the top card of their library, a card at random from their graveyard, and a card at random from their hand. You may cast a spell from among cards exiled this way without paying its mana cost. So, for 6 mana, you get a 5/5, and basically you get to cast a card for free. Now, it's a random card. If your opponent has no cards in hand, that obviously whiffs, but it takes a card from the graveyard. Oftentimes, a card from the graveyard is going to be a permanent or spell of some kind, and then also a random card from their library. So you basically, ideally, get to look at 3 random cards, right? And of the 3 random cards, you get to play something for free. So it's almost like a 6 mana 5/5 Cascade spell because it's playing something at random. And that's really solid. That is a very, very good card. 6 mana 5/5 with Cascade, kind of, but you can cast big things is really, really strong. And on top of that, the fact that you have this emerge from artifact, where let's say you have a 3 mana artifact, and then you sacrifice that, so you can play this on turn 4. Imagine emerging this on turn 4. as a 4-mana 5/5 that gets to play something big, potentially, randomly, this card's really, really strong, gives you a bunch of value. I'm going to give Carbomination an A because this is the type of card that can get you, that can push the advantage or also help you come back from behind because it's going to put either 2 permanents in play or this in play along with a spell from your opponent's hand, library, or graveyard. Next, we have the Dreadmobile. 2 and a black for a 3/3 vehicle. It's got Menace. 1 colorless, sack another artifact or creature, put a +1/+1 counter on Dreadmobile, and crew 1. So, vehicles are always going to be worse than creatures, but hey, 3 mana for a 3/3 Menace with a very cheap crew cost is not terrible. And the fact that this also has the sacrifice clause attached to it means they are really going out of their way here, it seems already, to make sure that there are enough sacrifice outlets in the format, which means the sacrifice theme seems to be pretty well supported, meaning that if that's what you're trying to do, then the Dreadmobile definitely gets a lot better. I'm going to give Dreadmobile a C, and I can imagine this being a very important card, especially if you're looking to draft kind of the black-white sacrifice deck, for example. Next, we have Dream Drinker Vampire. 2 mana for a 2/1 lifelinking vampire. 1 and a black, adapt 1. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Dream Drinker Vampire, it gains Menace until end of turn. All right, well, we're looking at a 2 mana 2/1 lifelinker with 1 and a black, adapt 1. That's already pretty decent. That's already just a card that I'm going to put in most of my decks. And then whenever you put a counter on this, you can also, for a turn, give this Menace and get in for 3 points of damage and gain life. I mean, Dream Drinker Vampire is just a pretty solid level creature to put in your decks. I'm going to give this a C. Moving on, we have Drossclaw. 1 and a black for an artifact equipment. It's a living equipment, which means when this equipment enters a battlefield, you create a 0/0 black Phyrexian Germ creature token, then attach this to it. Equipped creature gets +1/+1. Whenever equipped creature attacks, each opponent loses 1 life, and it's got an equip cost of 2 colorless mana. So effectively what this means is this is a 2 mana 1/1. When it attacks, you don't even drain your opponent. Your opponent loses 1 life, and then it's got an equip cost of 2. I'm not really into this card. 2 mana for a 1/1 with basically no effect. I mean, it's a pretty irrelevant effect. It's an artifact, it's an equipment, sure, but I just don't see where I would ever really want to play this card. I'm going to give Drossclaw a D. Next, we have a card that's certainly not a D, Emperor of Bones. 1 and a black for a 2/2 Skeleton Noble. At the beginning of combat on your turn, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. 1 and a black, adapt 2. So 2 mana for a 2/2, and for 2 mana you adapt 2, turning it into a 4/4. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Emperor of Bones, put a creature card exiled with Emperor of Bones onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter on it. It gains haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So, what does that mean? For 2 mana, you adapt this card, right? And then this becomes a 4/4. When you put the counter on the Emperor of Bones, you get to put any creature from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control with haste. That is a really, really nice ability. Now, remember, you can only do this once unless you can find other ways to put +1/+1 counters on Emperor of Bones. And this is certainly a card that you're absolutely interested in putting additional +1/+1 counters on this. But this is just a really solid creature. 2 mana for a 2/2 with adapt 2 for 2 is already very good. This disrupts your opponent's graveyard recursion shenanigans, and you can even use this defensively. So keep that in mind. Now, of course, you can't attack with the creature, but let's say there's a big Eldrazi in your opponent's graveyard or a big reach creature, and your opponent has you on the back foot. You can exile that creature, leave the 2 mana available on Emperor of Bones, and if they attack you, you just adapt, and then put that creature into play, and then block, and it just makes it a lot more difficult for your opponents to attack. So Emperor of Bones is an excellent, excellent creature. I am going to give it an A. Next, we have Etched Slith. 1 and a black for a 1/1 menace artifact creature, Phyrexian Slith. We all know what Sliths do, but if you didn't know, let me remind you. Whenever Etched Slith deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. When you do, you may remove a counter from another target permanent or opponent. So you can remove +1/+1 counters or any other type of counters from opponent's permanents. And, that's certainly something that's could be desirable, right? If your opponent adapts, you can remove some of those counters. And it's just a 2-mana, 1/1 menace creature that continues to grow. So this is definitely one of those cards that's awesome on the play and a lot less awesome on the draw, because let's say you play this on turn 2, then on turn 3, there's a pretty solid shot that you're going to be able to hit with this. And then turning this into a 2/2 menace, and then let's say you have a removal spell. I mean, this can get kind of snowbally. So it is pretty solid. But again, it's quite bad on the draw. In the artifact aggressive affinity deck, I think this card is very, very solid. I'm going to give Edgeslith a C. Next, we have Ethereum Pteramander. Black for a 1/1 artifact creature, Salamander Drake with flying. Ethereum Pteramander can block only creatures with flying. 6 and a black, adapt 4. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each other artifact you control. So this is a play on the original Pteramander, which is a blue 1/1 flyer that had the exact same adapt cost, 6 and a blue, but that one got cheaper for each spell in your graveyard, each instant or sorcery. So this is obviously just an amazing payoff if you are looking to play the artifact deck. So again, remember that this doesn't count itself as an artifact, so you're going to need to have other artifacts in play. So just imagine, let's say you're just playing this in your deck. It's a nice evasive creature. It turns on the affinity for all your other cards. And let's say you get 2 other artifacts in play. Then for 5 mana, boom, you get a 5/5 flyer. So I think Ethereum Pteramander is excellent in the affinity decks. And for the non-affinity decks, it's less good because it's a 1-mana, 1/1 flyer that can't block with a very expensive adaptability. So I think for those decks, it's probably like a low C level card. But for the artifact decks, that's very, very high on artifacts and cares about affinity, this could go up to kind of a B level type card. Moving on, we have Eviscerator's Insight. 1 and a black, instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sack an artifact or creature, draw 2 cards. It's got flashback of 4 and a black. So another sacrifice outlet. Black has no shortage of ways to sacrifice permanents. So this normally just is not a card that I'm too interested in playing. So I would give this a D in most decks. But black, but there are certain color combinations where you are really interested in sacrificing a lot of permanents. Also, let's say you're pairing this with green and you have lots of ways to create Eldrazi spawn. Well, now all of a sudden you can cash in those Eldrazi spawn for cards, and this card also has flashback. So I'm going to say that in kind of most black decks that don't care too much about sacrificing, I'm not too happy with Eviscerator's Insight, and I'd give it a D. But in decks that can really utilize the sacrifice, either by way of making a bunch of Scions, or Eldrazi spawns rather, or let's say you have a bunch of threaten effects, then I can see this moving up to a C level card. All right, moving on, we have the Fetid or Feted? Fetid? Fetid Gargantua. 4 and a black for a 4/4 horror. 2 and a black, adapt 2. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Fetid Gargantua, you may draw 2 cards. If you do, lose 2 life. So it's a 5-mana 2/2, and then when you adapt it, you basically get like almost a Phyrexian Gargantua type effect. And then if you can put more counters on it, you can draw more cards and lose more life. My only issue with this card, I mean, you play it as a 5-mana 4/4. So, and then if you really want to get value out of this, it costs a total of 8 mana for a 4/4 that draws you 2 and loses you 2 life. I just don't think that that's efficient enough. I know it's a late game mana sink, but even then, I'm not too happy taking Fetid Gargantua. I'm going to give this a D. Unless the format is just glacially slow, I'm just not interested in. Additionally, we went over the red cards, right? 2 of the red commons deal 4 damage. So if I'm going to pay a lot of mana for a big creature, I think that's going to be a really important number to kind of keep in mind. If you're going to spend a lot of mana on a creature, try to have it be a 5 toughness creature, because one of red's best commons is a lava coil, and one of the other best commons is a 6-mana 4/4 that enters a battlefield and deals 4 damage. There's an uncommon that's 3 mana and deals 4 damage, right? So there's just so many ways to deal 4 damage in this format where oftentimes they're going to be trading up on mana when you cast the Fetid Gargantua. So for that reason, I'm going to give it a D. I feel like they could have maybe juiced a stat on this. I mean, if you really wanted it to avoid the red removal spells, making it into a 4/5 would be pretty interesting, but as is, not too high on the Gargantua. Next, we have Flare of Malice. 2 black for an instant. It is a rare. You may sack a non-token black creature rather than pay this spell's mana cost. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the greatest mana value among creatures and planeswalkers they control. So each opponent for commander potentially, but for us, it's 4 mana. It's what was that card? Blot Out? It's a 4 mana Blot Out, right? 4 mana. They sack the biggest creature that they have that with the highest mana value. So if they have if they have 2 4 mana creatures, then they can choose which one to sacrifice. So you won't always get the thing that you want here. You're going to be guaranteed to get the biggest thing that they have. But if they have multiple, then you won't always be able to get the thing that they want. So for that reason, this is worse than just 4 mana kill a thing. There is also the added value of being able to sacrifice a non-token black creature, but sacrificing a creature is always just kind of a big cost to be able to do this, and it specifically has to be black as well. So I think this is kind of an okay removal spell, nothing too special. I would give Flare of Malice a C. Moving on, we have Gravedig. I love this card, just on flavor. 1 and a black, choose 1. Target player creates a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Or return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Entwine 2 colorless. I mean, this is beautiful. If you pay the entwine cost on this, I mean, look at the 2 modes of this card. With their powers combined, they are Captain Gravedigger, right? It's a 4 mana 2/2 zombie that enters a battlefield, returns a creature from your graveyard to your hand. That is excellent. Now, of course, the thing that also made Gravedigger so great was because you could chain the Gravediggers. If you have a Gravedigger in hand and you have one in the graveyard, you could do that, which is pretty nice. Anytime you return a Gravedigger, you just get added value. But with this card, you can also play this on turn 2, right? You can play this on curve if you have an aggressive start and make a 2/2 zombie. So I think Gravedig is a really, really solid card. I am basically never cutting this from my black decks. I'm giving Gravedig a C. Maybe a C+, but we're not doing pluses and minuses. Those are going to come once I've played with the set a little bit, and then I kind of update all the rankings. That's when I'll be more confident in my pluses and minuses. Right now, it's just too early. All right, Grim Servant, 3 and a black for a 3/2 Menace Zombie Warlock. This is an uncommon. When Grim Servant enters a battlefield, search your library for a card with mana value less than or equal to your devotion to black. Reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. You lose 3 life. Okay, well, I mean, this is a 4 mana 3/2 Menace creature, and at the cost of 3 life, you can search up something. So, with this card alone, I would definitely, if there's a card that costs a single black mana, for example, just one sec. If you have 1-drops in your when you're drafting, this certainly increases the value of 1-drops, because at the very least, you could play the Grim Servant and then go fetch a 1-drop, right? For the cost of 3 life. But if you're playing a heavier black deck, let's say you can do this for Devotion 3 or 4, then you're talking about a 4 mana 3/2 at the cost of 3 life. You get to just tutor up something. That is very, very solid, right? That is very, very solid. So I'm going to assume that in a lot of instances, this is going to be a 4 mana 3/2 Menace that on demand, you're going to be able to at least get like a 2-drop, right? You can at least get a 2-drop in most instances, maybe even a 3-drop. And I think that's just really solid. So I do like the Grim Servant. I'm going to give this a low B. All right, moving on, we have Kami of Jealous Thirst. This is 2 and a black for a 1/3 spirit with Death Touch. It's got 4 and a black. Each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This ability costs 4 and a black less to activate. If you've drawn 3 or more cards this turn, activate only once each turn. So this is revealing kind of the payoff, or this is revealing what the blue-black deck's trying to do. The blue-black deck's looking to draw cards and draft, it be kind of more of a controlling deck. And in that controlling deck, this is just kind of the type of stats that you want, right? A 3 mana 1/3 Death Touch creature basically rumbles with anything in trades, right? 3 toughness means it's also really good at just completely shutting down 2-drops, right? 2 mana 2/2s and what have you, just can't attack into the Kami of Jealous Thirst. And then if you are drafting a blue deck that can draw a bunch of cards, every now and then you get to drain them for 2 for free, right? And this also just acts as a mana sink. In the late game, if you just have mana laying around, you can just drain your opponent for 2 as well. So all in all, that's just a really solid mix of stats and abilities as a mana sink. I'm going to give Kami of Jealous Thirst a C. Next up, we have one of the more bizarre cards in the format, Crick. All right, if somebody can do a better pronunciation of this, but Crick, Son of Yawgmoth, 4 Phyrexian black mana, Phyrexian black mana, Phyrexian black mana for a 2/2 legendary creature, Phyrexian horror minion. Phyrexian black mana can be paid with either black mana or 2 life. It's got lifelink. For each black in a cost, you may pay 2 life rather than pay that mana. Whenever you cast a black spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Crick, Son of Yawgmoth. All right, let's break this down. A 2/2 is just wild to me. The earliest you can cast this is on turn 4, at the cost of 6 life. So you get a 4 mana 2/2 lifelinker, and it costs you 6 life to do so. Okay? So you're at 14 for a 2/2 lifelinker. Now, any black spell you cast after that, this gets a +1/+1 counter. And you can, and so let's say you play this turn 4, turn 5, maybe you get some discount, but every time you do, you still have to keep paying 2 life. So, like, this card just doesn't seem very good to me at all, right? This card, I mean, you 4 mana, pay 6 for a 2/2, and then let's say on the next turn you play a couple of black cards, maybe pay another 2 life, or 4 even, to get the discount. So that gives you some mana, I suppose. So it's effectively giving you 2 mana at the cost of 10 life. And then this becomes a 4/4 lifelinker. I just feel like this could have been bigger somehow. Maybe a 3/3. But I am not really a believer here at 2/2. I'm going to give Crick a low C. Possibly even a D. It just costs so much mana. Right? Like, if you pay the full amount, it's a 7 mana 2/2? Just like, I don't even know. I mean, maybe this is a cool commander card because you have more life to play with, but I mean, 6 life is a lot. But if you're not paying 6 life, you're paying 5 mana or 6 mana or 7 mana for, you know what? I'm gonna just say this is a D. I probably misread this card. Please let me know if I've misread this card. But this just looks like an overcosted, very painful way to get a medium-sized lifelinker creature onto the battlefield. Next, we have Lethal Throwdown. 1 black, sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature or sacrifice a modified creature. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. If the modified creature was sacrificed, draw a card. This is an uncommon. It's kind of interesting because I thought this type of effect would be a common. So there have been effects like this previously, which is common, and they've given you the out where you can pay more mana to just cast it for like 5 mana. But this doesn't give you that out. You have to sacrifice a creature. Now, this gives you another good way to sacrifice something, but at the same time, it doesn't give you that out. So I feel like in most decks, this is not going to be that great, right? I mean, just the fact that you're going to have to throw away a creature to kill something, I mean, that's just to me a D-level card. However, I feel like if you are a deck that's well set up for Lethal Throwdown, then this can be a pretty, decent Bone Splinters variant where you can sacrifice a modified creature to also draw a card. And in those decks, I think this can be a high C level removal spell. So I'm going to go D, build around C. Next, we have Marionette Apprentice. 1 and a black for a 1/2 human artificer with Fabricate 1. When this creature enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on it, or create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. Whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. So, just a really solid card, right? 2 mana for either a 2/3 or a 1/2 and a 1/1. So if, let's say, you're playing an affinity deck, this is a 2 mana artifact that gives you 2 power and 3 toughness worth of stats on the battlefield with a pretty relevant static ability, right? Whenever one of your artifacts or creatures dies, you also get to drain them, not drain them, you get to deal 1 damage to them. So just a solid creature. Red-black affinity is looking to be really aggressive, and this is exactly the type of card that you want in that type of deck. So I'm going to give Marionette Apprentice a B. Next, we have Mindless Conscription, 2 and a black enchantment. When Mindless Conscription enters the battlefield, and whenever you draw your 3rd card each turn, amass zombies 3. Put 3 +1/+1 counters on an army you control. It's also a zombie. If you don't control an army, create a 0/0 black zombie army creature token first. So, in any deck, this is a 2 mana, enters a battlefield, make a 3/3 token, which is fine, right? Not great. I think 3 mana for a 3/3 is low C, high D at best. So I think in just a normal deck that's really not able to draw 3 cards, I would give this kind of a very low C, possibly even a D level card. But if you are drafting the blue-black deck, right, that has multiple ways to draw 3 cards in a single turn, this seems like a pretty nice payoff card, right? Let's say you play this, and then on the following turn, you play some kind of a divination effect, right? That allows you to draw 3 cards on your turn. All of a sudden, you're looking at a 6/6 that you spent 3 mana to play, right? So this thing can get completely out of control, and you can end up with a gigantic zombie token. So I think in the blue-black draw cards deck, now you're not even in the draw cards deck, I can't imagine you having more than like 5 or 6 draw effects. That even then, that might be too many. So I think for that deck, though, I would give this a build around B, and then I would say for most other decks, I would give this a very low C. And you're just playing it as a 3 mana 3/3. I mean, if anything, because it's a token and it can get bounced. You know what? I changed my mind. I'm going to give it a D+ or a high D and a build around B for Mindless Conscription. All right, moving on. We have Nadier's Nightblade, 2 and a black for a 1/3 elf warrior. Whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So I'm not entirely sure how many other types of tokens you can create, but I do know for a fact that there's lots of ways to create Eldrazi Scions. It's really weird though, because then you would think that Nadier's Nightblade is wanted in something in one of the Teamer colors, because those are the ones that generally make all the Scions, because those are the Eldrazi colors. So you can't go too crazy with this. And when you're drafting an Eldrazi deck, you're mostly trying to ramp. You're not trying to get your opponents with chip damage, where the drain is as relevant. So, the body on this is also pretty bad. So I'm not a big fan of Nadier's Nightblade. I'm going to give it a D. Next, we have a very unique card, Necro Dominance. Well, is it unique? Because there's a card that existed that was this card, but just better. Necro Dominance, black, legendary enchantment, skip your draw step. At the beginning of your end step, you may pay any amount of life. If you do, draw that many cards. Your maximum hand size is 5. If a card or token would be put into your graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So, what does that mean? Well, it's basically Necropotence. It's Necropotence, except you can't draw infinite cards, right? With Necropotence, you could draw 10 cards and then sculpt the perfect 10 and discard down to 7. Now, if you draw a million cards, you can still draw a million cards, but you have to discard down to 5, which does make this card worse. Now, this is another nice payoff, or interesting payoff, I want to say. I don't even know if it's a nice payoff, but it's an interesting payoff if you do end up drafting mono black or extremely heavy black, but I just don't think this card's going to be that good in a lot of instances. Your maximum hand size is 5. Remember, you're skipping your draw step. So you're using all of your life as a resource to draw cards. So I just don't know how good that this card's going to be in most instances. I'm going to give Necro Dominance a D. But maybe there's a world where if you're mono black, if there's enough support for that, maybe this goes up to like a B level card if you're specifically mono black with, for example, the black instant that lets you gain a bunch of life for how many swamps you have and you deal a bunch of damage. Like if you have a lot of ways to deal damage, gain a bunch of life, then you can draw more cards, right? So that works well with a card like the Necro Dominance, but not something that I'm too interested in taking early. Next, we have a Goyf. Another Goyf, black for a star, 1+ star. Lurgoyf, mythic rare. Another Goyf's power is equal to the number of card types among cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that number +1. It's got escape, 2 and a black, exile any number of other cards from your graveyard with 4 or more card types among them. Alright, so you want to play this card, obviously, in a deck that can really put a lot of different types of cards in your graveyard. If you have nothing, this is a 0/1. And this is basically a Tarmogoyf, but it only counts your graveyard, right? It only counts your graveyard and not also your opponent's graveyard, which does make the card considerably worse. I think in a lot of instances, I'm trying to imagine just like a normal game of Magic. A creature goes into the graveyard, maybe a spell, there's a fetch land. So in a lot of instances, this is probably going to be like a 2/3 or a 3/4. If you have some self-mill, yeah, it can be even up to a 4 or 5, right? And for 1 mana, that is pretty nice. Now, when you escape this card, oftentimes this is going to come in as something very small, right? Because you're going to need to exile 4 different types to escape this. Meaning you're probably only going to have like 2 other cards left in your graveyard. So when you escape it, it's still going to be a 2/3. But I mean, how much can you ask out of a 1-drop, right? The thing is, when you play this early, it basically doesn't do anything, right? Turn 1, nothing. Turn 2, nothing. Turn 3, nothing. So you have to think of this more as something that's cheap that maybe becomes useful, maybe turn 4 or turn 5, and maybe then this can grow into like a decent sized card. But because it doesn't really have any impact on the game early, and you have to go through some hoops to have it be good in the late game, I'm going to give this a C. But I will admit that this is a card that certainly explodes in value if you have a deck that lets you churn through your deck very quickly. For example, the blue-black deck is looking to draw a bunch of cards, so you're casting a bunch of spells, and the green-black deck might be looking to self-mill. And if you self-mill, then all of a sudden this card becomes awesome, right? Because all you need to do is cast one mulch-type card, the one in a green sorcery that lets you look at the top 4, put a bunch of cards into your graveyard, and then you play this. If you have a deck built around this, so I want to say by itself it's a C, but I could see this be like a build around B in the right type of deck. Next up, we have Ophiomancer, an oldie but a goodie. 2 and a black for a 2/2 human shaman. At the beginning of each upkeep, if you control no stakes, create a 1 black snake creature token with Death Touch. This card's awesome. This card is awesome because you play it, you might not get the snake right away, right? But you get it on your opponent's upkeep. Meaning it's basically impossible for your opponent to attack you with ground creatures unless they kill the Ophiomancer. And if they can't, what are they going to do? They attack you, you trade, and then guess what? You get another snake back on the next upkeep, right? And black has lots of ways to get creatures back from the graveyard. This card is just incredible. I mean, it's a card that you see in Cube Draft, and my thing is, if you see a card in Cube Draft, it's likely going to be very, very close to a B or an A in normal limited. And Ophiomancer is no exception. This just makes it basically impossible for ground creatures to attack you because you continue to get that token back. Additionally, black's looking to sacrifice a lot of things, right? So you can sack the black snake token for whatever effect that you have. There's a lot of different things that care about sacrificing, and then you get the token back. So Ophiomancer is going to get a low A from me. I think the card is very, very solid. Moving on, we have Quest for the Necropolis, black enchantment, landfall. Whenever land enters a battlefield under your control, put a quest counter on Quest for the Necropolis. 5 and a black, sacrifice Quest for the Necropolis, put target creature card from a graveyard under your control. This ability costs 1 colorless less to activate for each quest counter on Quest for the Necropolis. Activate only as a sorcery. So, the important thing here, there's a couple things. The first one is it targets any graveyard, right? So it's not just your graveyard. This is just a reanimate or animate dead, any of those types of effects, okay? Now, if you play this early, like turn 1, this means that, by the time you get to like turn 4 or turn 5, there's going to be a target, right? And when you do, you're going to be able to use this for 3 or 2 mana, right? Which is pretty nice. Now, if you draw this in the late game, it is pretty expensive, right? Like, let's say you draw this turn 4, then you play it, maybe turn 5, you draw a land, then you're spending 5 to 6 mana to be able to get something back. But again, because you can get back something large from either graveyard, that's pretty strong. And you can use this as a way to maybe let you have some self-mill and you find some Eldrazi that goes into your graveyard, you can put that Eldrazi back into play as well. So I think Quest for the Necropolis is pretty solid. I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Refurbished Familiar. 3 and a black for a 2/1 zombie rat. Affinity for artifacts. It's got flying. Whenever Refurbished Familiar enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. For each opponent who can't, you draw a card. This card's awesome. This card's awesome. I mean, even if you're not playing the artifact strategy and you're just playing a regular deck, it is a 4-mana 2/1 flyer that makes them discard a card. So you always get a 2-for-1 here, right? It's a 4-mana 2/1 flyer. If they can't discard a card, you draw a card. So this is just a card you're going to play in all of your black decks. And of course, if you're playing an artifact deck, I mean, imagine, I think the thing that you'll see most often is you play like a 1-mana artifact or a 2-mana artifact. You play this on turn 3. It's a 3-mana 2/1 flyer that makes your opponent discard a card. That is fantastic. That is a lot of value. So, in the affinity decks, obviously this card gets much, much better. I think Refurbished Familiar is very solid. I'm going to give this a high C. And in the affinity decks, I could potentially see this being, I could see this get close to being even maybe the best black common if you really, really are leaning into the artifact deck, right? Because if you're just like 1-mana artifact, let's see the crazy draw of like 1-mana artifact, turn 2, double 1-mana artifact, turn 3, you can play like 2 of these things. That's not that's not going to happen too often. Or 1-drop artifact, 2-drop artifact. You play a 3-mana card. Next turn 4, you play 2 of these. Right? There's just a lot of different ways this card can just be absurd. So this could be even better than I think it is, but I think it's very strong. I'm going to give this a high C, possibly a low B in the artifact decks, but we'll go with high C for now. Next, we have Retrofitted Transmogrant. Black for a 1/1 artifact creature zombie. 3 and a black. Return Retrofitted Transmogrant from your graveyard to the battlefield, tapped with 2+1/+1 counters on it. So this is a really cool card. Number one, we've seen black really leaning into the sacrifice stuff, right? And this is the perfect card to sacrifice, right? It's a 1-drop. You can sacrifice it, and then in the late game, it comes back as a 3/3, right? Now, paying 4 mana to get a 3/3 is not great, but it's just extra value on top of the fact that you already got some value out of this because presumably let's say you sacrifice this to draw 2 cards, right? Then you pay 4 mana, comes back into play, and it's just a really sticky threat. So I feel like in most black decks, you're always just kind of happy to have 1 copy of this. If you're either playing artifacts, because this is an artifact creature, so in Affinity, you also want this card, or a sacrifice deck, right? This is a card that you're going to be happy having in both, so I'm going to give the Transmogrant a C. Moving on, we have Ripples of Undeath. 1 and a black for an enchantment. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, mill 3 cards. Then you may pay 1 colorless or you may pay 1 generic and 3 life. A very big difference because this you can tap any mana. If you do, put a card from among those cards and put them into your hand. So the turn you play this, you cannot draw cards because again, this is your pre-combat main phase. So on the next turn in your main phase is when this ability happens. It's a nice way to mill yourself. And then you don't necessarily have to pay a life, but you can if you want. And then you pay 3 life and you put one of those cards into your hand. So here's the thing though. If you don't care about the mill and only care about the card advantage that you can gain from this, you're paying 3 mana and 3 life to look at the top 3 cards and put one of those cards into your hand. Okay? Then on the next turn, you're paying a total of 4 mana and 6 life. 4 mana and 6 life to look at the top 6 cards and put 2 cards into your hand. I'm not sure if that's good. Also, you can't stop this from happening. You always mill 3 cards. So you got to be really careful with this as well because you might just deck yourself, right? So I just feel like there's enough of a very low floor here where I'm not a super big fan of this. I think it's more of a maybe constructed card because you have more deck to work with. I'm going to give the Ripples of Undeath a D. Maybe if you're playing a deck that really cares about the graveyard, right? Like let's say you have Nethergoyf and stuff, this can be a little bit better there. But I think in most instances, this card's going to be an underperformer relative to all the fancy words that you see on this card. Next, we have Scurrilous Sentry, 3 and a black for a 2/3 human knight rogue creature. It's got Menace. When Scurrilous Sentry enters the battlefield or attacks, it connives. Draw a card, then discard a card. If you discarded a non-land card, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. I just don't think the stats on this card is particularly exciting. If you want this to actually grow the turn that you play it, you're going to have to sacrifice a real spell, right? And if you don't, then you got to loot and you have a 4-mana 2/3 body, which is not that exciting. Now, of course, when it attacks, you also get to connive again, which makes it a little bit better because then it's like 4 mana. Let's say you discarded a spell, it's a 3/4, then you attack, then it becomes a 4/5 menace. But I'm still not necessarily sold on this just because the initial rate on this isn't especially good. I'm going to give Scurrilous Sentry a high D. It's like a filler level card if you need. It doesn't really synergize with anything else either that Black's trying to do. Next we have Shilgengar, Sire of Famine. 3 black for a 6/6 legendary Elder Demon with flying. So it's a 5-mana 6/6 flyer. No downside. Sack another creature. Create a blood token. If you sacrificed an angel this way, create a number of blood tokens equal to its toughness instead. White-black hybrid, white-black hybrid, white-black hybrid. So you can play any combination of 3 white or 3 black. Sacrifice 6 blood tokens. Return each creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Those creatures are vampires in addition to their types. So, let's just start with 5-mana 6/6 flyer. Yeah, that's awesome. That is nearly an A-level card by itself, right? That is nearly an A-level card by itself. Then you have the other mode, Ungated Sacrifice. You can always sack a creature to create a blood token. Again, that threaten card. I keep coming back to that. That is a card that's a C-level card in these red-black sacrifice decks, even if that's what you want to do. You can make a blood. I don't know how many angels there are, but if you can sacrifice an angel and get a bunch of blood really quick, all of a sudden, you can return all the creature cards in your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. And what a finality counter is when the creature dies, it gets exiled. But what you can do is, perhaps you can even just like sack your whole board and then just bring it back. And this also is at instant speed. You can do this at instant speed, which is pretty nuts, right? So let's say you attack with all your creatures and you already have a couple blood lying around and you have enough to get 6 blood. When they attack you or whatever, you can sack 4 things and bring everything back into play to block. Or let's say your opponent makes an alpha strike. You go put 4 creatures in front of their things, sack them all, get 4 blood, pay 3 mana, sack all 6 blood tokens, and put all those creatures back into play. So this card is amazing. It's incredible. Do not pass it. One of the better rares in the entire set. Shilgengar is in A. Next we have Sorin of House Markov. 1 and a black for a 1/4 legendary human noble. It's got lifelink. So 2 mana for a 1/4 lifelink, already just a decent blocker, with Extort. Whenever you cast a spell, you may pay white or a black mana. If you do, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain that much life. At the beginning of your post-combat main phase, if you gained 3 or more life this turn, exile Sorin of House Markov, then return him to the battlefield transformed under his owner's control. So very important here. Very important here. You cannot transform this before you attack. This is on your second main phase. But if you're able to gain 3 life, then you get to flip this. How easy is that going to be? Well, if this attacks and hits, you get to drain them for 1. And then if you can play maybe 2 small things and extort twice, you can flip it. Or you can just play some other spell that gains you some life. We'll have to do a pass on that to see how often that's going to happen. But I feel like you can probably find a way to get this to flip. And if you do, you get Sorin, Ravenous Neonate. This has the static of Extort. Legendary Planeswalker, 3 loyalty. +2, create a food token. -1. Sorin, Ravenous Neonate, deals damage equal to the amount of life you gained this turn to any target. -6, gain control of target creature. It becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. Put a lifelink counter on it if you control a white permanent other than that or Sorin. So if you can flip this card is amazing. The question is, how easy is it to flip the Sorin, right? You need to be able to find a way to gain 3 life, right, before. But if you do, the backside is an A-level card. Because let's say, for example, you play Sorin of House Markov, gain 3 life, okay? Exactly 3 life. And then you flip this. Then you can -1 this card immediately. And you will deal 3 damage to anything. Right? You will flip this immediately and be able to deal 3 damage to something. And then if you make and then on the following turn, you can make a food, tick it up to 4 loyalty, then sack the food for 2 mana. And then on the following turn, you sack the food for 2 mana, gain 3 life, and then you can kill something again. Or you just tick this up twice, and then you can steal a creature. So all those modes are amazing, but it does require some setup. You are not always going to flip this, and it's not even necessarily going to be trivial in a lot of instances. It's pretty hard to be able to connect with this and double extort to gain the 3 life. So you might need to find some other way to gain life. But if you do, the upside and payoff is there here on Sorin. So I'm going to give Sorin a B, mostly because I think the flip side is close to an A-level card, but because of the difficulty in being able to flip this card to begin with. Next, we have the Creation of Avacyn. 1 black for an uncommon saga. Chapter 1, search your library for a card, exile it face down, then shuffle. Chapter 2, turn the exile card face up. If it's a creature card, you lose life equal to its mana value. Chapter 3, you may put the exile card onto the battlefield if it's a creature card. If you don't put it onto the battlefield, put it into its owner's hand. So, it's a tutor, but it's really slow, right? Turn 3, like, if you get a creature, it's going to be really painful. If you get like a 5-drop creature, you play this, then you take 5, and then it comes into play. Now, if you can kind of set up a board where you don't just get run over and die because of that, that's fine. I think in a lot of instances, you can just use this as a very, very slow tutor to go fetch for a spell, which means then you don't take any damage. Now, you don't get the discount to put it into play for free, but you get to tutor for a card. But you can't get that card until 2 turns later, right? Which might be too late. So I don't think this card is absurd. If you have a bomb to get, maybe this card goes up a little bit in value. But I'm going to give the Creation of Avacyn a C. I could see this card definitely be worse. And I can see instances where it can be better. But you really need to find a way to... Let's say you get an Eldrazi with this, like an 8-drop. You play this. You go down to 12. And then you get hit as well. You could potentially just die before your Eldrazi just even wins or stabilizes the game for you. So, yeah, I'm not entirely sold on this, so I'm going to give it a C for now. Gonna want to play with this and see how it plays a little bit first. The speed of the format also will be very, very important with determining how good this card's going to be. Next, we have an oldie, Toxic Deluge. 2 and a black sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, pay X life. All creatures get -X/-X. This is a sweeper that you can control. It costs 3 mana. You can kill all small things if you have big things. I mean, this card is just an excellent, excellent sweeper. It's cheap. It's splashable. Toxic Deluge gets an A from me. Next, we have Victimize. 2 and a black for a sorcery. It's an uncommon. Choose 2 target creature cards in your graveyard. Sacrifice a creature. If you do, return the chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. So this is kind of a super reanimate spell. If you can sack something small and return 2 ginormous creatures, that would be great. This combos well with another card that we saw way earlier that I gave a D, which was Buried Alive, right? Buried Alive into Victimize to get a couple of Eldrazi onto the battlefield can be really good. But the difference between Buried Alive and Victimize is this card is just good by itself, right? If you have some light milling or you play this as kind of the last card out of your hand, you can sack something small and get 2 things back into play. I really do think Victimize is very solid. I'm going to give this a low B. Maybe just, I'm just going to give it a B. We'll figure out where it lies. Let's give it a B. Next, we have Warren Soul Trader. 2 and a black for a 3/3 zombie goblin wizard. Pay 1 life, sack another creature, create a treasure token. Another way to sacrifice creatures for free. You don't have to pay mana. You just have to pay life. This is a 3 mana 3/3 unconditional sacrifice outlet with all you have to do is pay a life to make a treasure. I think this is solid. The body itself isn't that impressive. It's a 3 mana 3/3, but again, black is really just looking to sacrifice things, and this is just a great way to do so. It allows you to ramp while also sacrificing things for potential profit, right? So, just sacrificing something that you steal or sacrificing a persist creature, right? We saw the multicolored persist creature. You can use that to make 2 treasures. There's a lot of different ways where I think Warren Soul Trader can be pretty useful. So I'm going to give this a low B. Moving on, we have Wither and Bloom. 1 and a black for an instant. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. Sign me up. Candy Grapple, right? That was the best black common in that set. 1 and a black. Exile Wither and Bloom from your graveyard. Put a +1/+1 target counter on target creature you control. Activate only as a sorcery. So, most people would be completely fine with just 1 and a black. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. But this also has some added value. Yeah, this card is excellent. I mean, this card is a high C, potentially a B, if you care about the +1/+1 counters. Now, of course, every deck cares about +1/+1 counters, but what I mean is specifically, those cards that get additional value when you get +1/+1 counters placed on them. For example, the 2-mana 2/1 lifelink zombie that we talked about earlier, when that card gets a +1/+1 counter on it, it gets menace until end of turn. So that works really well with the Wither and Bloom. So I'm actually, when we go over the commons, I'm actually not sure what the best black common is going to be, but I will tell you there are 2 premium black removal spells in this format, and this is one of them. So I'm going to give Wither and Bloom a high C, but I can see this also being a low B. Moving on to our final card, Wurmcoil Larva. This is a play on Wurmcoil Engine. 3 black for a 3/3 Death Touch lifelinking artifact Phyrexian Worm. When Wurmcoil Larva dies, create a 1/2 black Phyrexian Worm artifact creature token with Death Touch, and a 2/1 black Phyrexian Worm artifact token with lifelink. I mean, this card's great. It's a 5-mana 3/3 Death Touch lifelinker. When you trade, it makes another Death Toucher and a 2/1 black worm token. This card is just has value written all over it. Very, very solid. It is nowhere near as powerful as Wurmcoil Engine, just because for 1 more mana, you get a 6/6 instead of a 3/3. So that is a pretty big difference. And of course, you can play that in any deck. But Wurmcoil Larva gets... I don't give pluses or minuses that often, but I'm going to give this one a B+. Wurmcoil Larva is very, very solid. So there you have it, folks. Those are all the black cards. And now let's go over the top black commons. And starting things off here at number 5, we have the Retrofitted Transmogrant. I think this card is just going to be a key player in most of the black strategies. Now, this card goes really, really well in the sacrifice theme, right? Because it just gives you something to sacrifice, and then you can get it back into play. And then also in the affinity decks, just to have a cheap artifact to play that lets you kind of turbo out some of the affinity cards that you have in your deck. So I think this is just going to be a nice kind of glue card for both of those strategies, and I would be surprised if you cut this card in either of those decks. Coming in at number 4, we have Gravedigger. Gravedig. 1 in a black, 2/2. Make a 2/2 zombie, or Entwine, return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. I think this is just a really, really solid card. It's going to be a 2-for-1 every time. If you get something back from the graveyard, I'm never going to cut this in my decks. I think this is just a really, really solid card. Again, the fact that you can play this turn 2 to curve out, it's not ideal, but you have that as an option, is also really, really solid. So really like Gravedig. Coming in at number 3, we have Refurbished Familiar. And this is definitely the card that I feel like has potentially a higher ceiling, depending on how this format plays out. But this card is just value on a stick. It's a guaranteed 2-for-1, 4 mana for a 2/1 flyer, making your opponent discard. And if they have no cards, even in the super late game, they just gave you the out of being able to draw a card. That was completely unnecessary, but they gave it to us. And if you just have one artifact in play, turning this into a 3-mana 2/1 with this effect, that is fantastic. So really, really like Refurbished Familiar. That is our 3rd best common. This being the 3rd best black common is generally a pretty good sign for black. Coming in at number 2, and this was really close. I wasn't sure which one I should put at number 1, but Wither and Bloom, 2 mana, instant. Target creature gets -3/-3, just an excellent removal spell. And then it also just gives you extra value, right? Just for no reason. No, there was a reason. I trust the people that made this set. I'm sure there was a reason. And that just makes this card even better, right? Just the extra +1/+1 counter is absolutely huge. It's just a free roll. Love Wither and Bloom. And again, I could see this being the best common. But for currently, at number 1, I have Breathe Your Last as the best common. This is unconditional removal. It kills all the creatures. Every now and then you're going to kill a planeswalker, and it gains you life. Oftentimes this is going to gain you 1, sometimes 2 life when you kill something. So 3 mana to kill anything and gain you 1 or 2 life is just really, really strong, especially because there are going to be some color combinations that's going to be looking to either emerge or cast very large Eldrazi, and having an unconditional removal spell for that, I think, is going to be very important. Whereas when you look at a card like Wither and Bloom, it's nice, cheap, and efficient, and against specific color combinations like red-white, for example, this is probably better, but I mean, maybe not even that much better, right? This still kills anything and gains you the life. So for now, I'm going to have Breathe Your Last here as the best common, but I do think it's extremely close between Breathe Your Last and Wither and Bloom. But honestly, Black's commons look pretty juiced, at least the top 4. Retrofitted Transmogrian is kind of more of the filler level card, but Breathe Your Last and Wither and Bloom are both premium level common removal spells that rival actually the red removal spells that we just went over. But a Refurbished Familiar is an excellent 3rd best common that could be 2nd best or 1st best. First best, just best. If you're drafting an affinity deck, I totally wouldn't fault anybody for taking as many Refurbished Familiars as they can, and I can see Refurbished Familiar even being number 1 in an aggressive affinity deck, just because then you're looking at a card that's an artifact that can be a 2-mana 2/1 flyer with this effect, which is amazing. So really liking Black's suite of removal spells, just premium removal spells. And these removal spells are also kind of the reason why I said previously that normally just creatures that are good on rate, I value a little bit less, because it seems to me that the removal spells are a little bit stronger than you see in previous sets. So because the removal is stronger and they're common than just normal creatures that don't do anything, like if a creature just comes like a 3-mana 4/4, that's good, that's great, but it's a little bit worse here, right? Because you have Lava Coil, Breathe Your Last as ways to kill it, but a 3-mana 3/3 that enters a battlefield and gives you a spawn token, right? Or gives you 3 energy or something like that, that's a lot better. Because removal is so good, having creatures that enters a battlefield and gives you some other resource is kind of what you should be looking for. But going back to Black, looks strong, good removal. The sacrifice theme looks really exciting. So really excited to play with both the sacrifice strategies that Black's looking to showcase and also kind of the artifact decks as well. So Black looking to be in a pretty good spot. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Feel free to hit the like or subscribe button for more daily videos just like this. If you've enjoyed the content and wanted to support the channel in another way, I do have a Patreon channel. The link to the Patreon is in the description below. Shout out to all the current patrons. Thank you so much for allowing me to continue doing all of this good work. Additionally, if you wanted to go back and check out all my ratings for the Black cards, the link to that is also in the description below, so make sure you check that out. Once again, when I'm done with everything, there will be a master sheet you can refer to guide you in your 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 10th draft of Modern Horizons 3. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you tomorrow.